Thank you, Nick. First, I'm not a doctor, so I'm quite honored to be called a doctor, but I'm not. So just a quick correction. And the other point I wanted to make as an introduction, if you could tell me when I've reached 15 minutes so that I can wrap up, because I may exceed otherwise a bit my time. So my name is Julien Potet. I work at the MSF Access campaign. I'm going to speak about access to antivenoms in the developing world. And this is part of the result of a multidisciplinary analysis that was conducted. My speech is based on the findings and recommendations that were published last year in a special issue of Toxiconex. There are different ways to analyze challenges for antivenom access. For our paper, we have tried as much as possible to look at it through the lens of several disciplines, and that's why we have gathered a multidisciplinary team, an international team of scientists with experts in many different fields: anti-serum production, clinical care, health policy, epidemiology, supply chain management, just to cite a few. Our objectives were to list and to review all possible barriers to access to safe and effective antivenoms, and then to recommend concrete solutions. We used a framework that had been previously designed for access to insulin. We looked at 3 different stages of the journey of an antivenom product, from the manufacturing site to the bedside of the patient. The upstream stage corresponds more or less to the international level, the midstream stage to the national level, more or less, and the downstream stage to the local and community level. I will not read all the research questions now. I will come back on several occasions on that specific slide during my speech step by step. For each group of questions, we gathered and reviewed literature, including gray literature. But I need to say that our work is definitely not a systematic review, because in any case, in the first place, there were too many research questions to address. So it should be considered more like the expert opinion of our group, more than a review, a systematic review. So let's have a look now at the first level, the upstream stage. We will analyze issues related to the manufacture of antivenom products. And the first questions we asked ourselves were the following ones. Do antivenoms exist for all medically important snake species? Is the global antivenom manufacturing output sufficient to cover global needs? What is the typical profile of antivenom manufacturers? Are there many substandard antivenom products in the markets of low and middle income countries? Before looking at these individual questions, it is important to note, I think, that antivenom products are very peculiar, very particular pharmaceutical products. They are bespoke or tailor-made pharmaceutical products that are specific to a limited range of venomous snake species. There are different products for different regions of the world. As a result, if we look at it from an economic and industrial perspective, there is no such thing as a global antivenom market. Instead, there are several sub-regional markets that are mainly delineated by the geographical distribution of venomous snake species. This is quite peculiar, I think, in the pharmaceutical industry compared to products usually that have a more or less a global market. As a result of this fragmented market, it is not a surprise that global supply of antivenom actually relies on a lot of small suppliers around the world. And this map lists the countries where there is at least one antivenom producer. Approximately 2/3 of the listed antivenom producers in this map are public institutions, not private companies. Most producers listed here just make antivenoms for their own countries or for the neighboring countries, but not for the global markets, not for other markets, no more than their countries and their neighbors. And you can see on this map that there are no antivenom producers in certain regions of the world. The most striking example is Sub-Saharan Africa, where there is currently only one antivenom manufacturer based in South Africa. In addition, this producer in South Africa manufactures products primarily for its domestic market, and only a limited amount of ampules are actually exported to other countries in the region. In addition, antivenoms that are available in a given region do not always match well the list of medically important snake species that are endemic in this region. For example, all antivenom products marketed in the Indian subcontinent are specific for the big 4 species. But there are many more venomous snake species in the region. And it's often unclear if the existing antivenoms are able to protect against these other venoms through paraspecific activity. For example, Naja caothia and Ifnale are very important, medically important snake species in the region. And it's very unclear if existing antivenoms have any clinical benefit, major clinical benefit for this species. And you can see on this map that Naja caothia and Ifnale are particularly endemic in South India in the latter case, and in northeast of India and Bangladesh for Naja caothia. Then we try to estimate the global antivenom output, but I'd like to make an important point first. The number of antivenom vials is one thing. It may be relatively easy to estimate this number, but the number of effective antivenom treatments is much more difficult to estimate because, as was mentioned before, the mean number of vials that are needed to treat an envenomation varies a lot from one product to another and from one bite to another. In addition, the dosages recommended by the manufacturers should be taken with a grain of salt and are often based on very limited preclinical and clinical evidence. So with these caveats in mind, we found a survey from 2011 that estimated that the national production of antivenoms in India had reached the equivalent of between 100,000 and 400,000 treatment courses, while there are between 1.1 and 1.7 million cases in India alone every year. Another survey, unpublished in 2020 by the Global Snakebite Initiative, obtained data from 22 producers and estimated that 6 million vials or ampoules intended for low and middle-income countries were produced annually. This equates to less than 1 million treatment courses. This is far below the 2.7 million cases of snakebite envenoming requiring antivenom therapy every year around the world. Based on these estimates, we are fairly confident to claim that the annual global antivenom output is insufficient to compare to needs. Then we looked at antivenom quality and the marketing of substandard products. For the sake of our meeting today, I will just describe a few problems, not all of them. There are many different situations, but generally speaking, our expert group thinks that antivenom markets are poorly regulated in several regions, where it was described by David particularly. The WHO until recently didn't have many resources to assess whether manufacturers were able to comply with its own guidelines, but the situation has drastically improved over the last 5 years. And now we are confident to believe that the WHO will be able to conduct assessments for Sub-Saharan Africa. It's almost completed. And the next one is for Asia and the Middle East region. However, generally speaking, the group believed that antivenom markets are poorly regulated. And over the last years, several anecdotal reports and post-marketing observational studies have pointed towards the marketing of ineffective antivenom products, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa. In most cases, the incriminated products had been brought to market without any clinical data and even without any preclinical data before approval. A review in 2019 found that among 16 different antivenoms intended for use in Africa, only 3 had been evaluated through robust clinical studies. So for several of these products, it was only during the field use that cases of poor clinical response became obvious. And finally, one clear example of fabricated regulatory data was recently revealed by a civil society organization in Ghana. Let's now have a look at the second level, the midstream stage. We look into issues such as registration and marketing, pricing, national supply chains. And for the sake of time, I will focus only on the following questions. Why are not antivenoms at country level necessarily the most adapted and effective ones? What are the mean prices for antivenoms? Who pays for antivenom? Does this lead to catastrophic health expenditure? Countries that need to import antivenom products from abroad are particularly at risk to import antivenoms that are not adapted to local snake species. Procurement agencies may mistakenly import products that are not meant to be used in their region. This situation has been documented anecdotally on several occasions. For example, in Ethiopia, the only antivenom purchased by the National Procurement Agency until recently was a polyvalent antivenom product made in Egypt and meant to be used against Egyptian snake species, but definitely not against the species in Ethiopia. This example is actually a bit extreme and does not necessarily reflect the situations in other countries of the developing world. However, our expert group had the feeling that it is much more difficult to follow good distribution and procurement practices for antivenom products compared to other pharmaceutical products. Now let's have a look at prices and costs. Before describing the situation, I'd like to show a table with a hypothetical case. We included a slightly different table in our publication. This table is not based on real numbers. It is meant to show that the final treatment costs do not only depend upon the cost per vial, as was mentioned by Mike, but also upon the intrinsic potency of the antivenom product for each individual venom. While the price per vial is lower for antivenom 2, the most cost-effective option for venoms A and C in this table is actually antivenom number 1. And the best option for venom B is antivenom number 3. However, as was discussed before, unfortunately, health authorities in resource-limited settings very rarely look at cost-effectiveness estimates when they acquire antivenoms. And actually, cost-effective studies comparing different antivenom are actually quite rare. In many low-income countries, payments to access antivenom come directly from the pockets of the snakebite victims, and there does not exist any national financing mechanism. And in countries where schemes like that, a national financing mechanism exists actually, these mechanisms are often under-resourced and restricted. In Burkina Faso, for example, a financing scheme was able to co-pay for the costs of antivenom, but it was estimated that only 4% of snakebite patients were able to access this financing mechanism. So the predominant rule in many low-income countries is that snakebite victims need to pay for antivenoms out of their pockets. And the exception is that a national insurance system is able to cover the costs. Under these conditions, it is not a surprise that snakebite victims may have a preference for products with a lower cost per vial, regardless of the true effectiveness of the product. If the costs of the product were covered by a national insurance or another kind of public financing scheme, then it would be easier to prioritize antivenoms with the best cost-effectiveness ratios. With all these caveats in mind, we tried in our paper to review the costs and affordabilities of antivenom products in resource-limited settings. Unit prices of antivenom products are extremely variable, but generally speaking, these costs often represent a large share of the wages of snakebite victims. For example, in Kenya, it was shown that just one vial of antivenom costs the equivalent of 14 days of the mean wages of low-level workers. Other papers have tried to look at the average costs of an effective antivenom treatment course in sub-Saharan Africa. Estimates vary quite a bit, but a 2020 survey by the Global Snakebite Initiative estimated that an effective starting dose in sub-Saharan Africa would cost on average around $463. Since snakebite affects primarily impoverished farming communities in Africa, this amount of money may be unaffordable for most victims. And there are actually multiple reports of catastrophic health expenditure as a consequence of treatment of snakebite and venoming. In public health, catastrophic health expenditures refer to payments that bring the family of the patient further into debt and poverty. For example, a study in Sri Lanka found that 40% of snakebite victims who paid for their treatment had to either sell valuable items, including crops, cattle, and family land, or even remove their children from education and send them to work. Once again, we need to keep in mind that situations are very diverse from one region to another, but in certain countries of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, we believe that out-of-pocket payments can be a very serious obstacle to access to effective antivenoms. Finally, let's look at the downstream stage, at what happened at district and community levels. Once again, I will not be able to describe all the points we made in our paper, and I focus instead on the following questions. Are antivenoms available and in stock in health facilities? How can we plan, model, and optimize geographical access to antivenom? Do healthcare workers use antivenom therapy rationally? Sorry for the last question. I will not address the last question on traditional healing finally. So there's a lot of repetition with what has been said before. Snakebite is a condition that overwhelmingly affects rural communities. But at the same time, in many countries, antivenom is restricted to facilities staffed by doctors, where effective management of complications such as adverse drug reactions and local tissue injury is available. This leads to a situation where antivenoms are offered in facilities that may be geographically quite far from where the patient was bitten. Delays in transporting victims to the nearest hospital where antivenom is available is a major problem. An extreme example of that situation is the Amazon region in Brazil. A publication has carefully described the itineraries and the different means of travel that victims need to use to reach facilities by water, by land, and even by air. The journey often took more than 1 full day. It's a fascinating study that I invite you to read. That's why it's important to try to optimize the geographical distribution of antivenom. It was mentioned by Raphael particularly. The use of geographic information system may be of great help. They can be used to measure the physical accessibility to health facilities and to measure the vulnerability of the different communities, and then to plan antivenom and distribution networks accordingly. One of the first studies of that sort was done in Costa Rica, where GIS mapping has been used to identify areas in need of improved access to antivenom based on different criteria. Such systems can be useful to optimize the list of facilities storing antivenom and also to build efficient referral networks that are adapted to the local geographical constraints. Now let's speak about antivenom stockouts. Antivenom stockouts in facilities represent another major problem. They have been reported in many different settings. A survey in Kenya, for example, in Kenya, Uganda, and Zambia in 2018 found that only about 20% of healthcare workers in each country said that their health facility had the medicines needed to treat snakebite. And antivenom in these countries was in stock at the time of the survey in less than 1/3 of the facilities where antivenom is supposed to be available. More research is needed to understand why the risk of stockout seems to be much higher for antivenom than other drugs. It may be due to the fact that some health facilities want to store only a limited number of antivenom vials at any given time, for fear that this expensive pharmaceutical product expires unused and is wasted. If instead, if the stock remains small at any given time, of course, the risk of stockout is high. Generally speaking, high level of irrational antivenom use, and particularly underuse and underdosing, have been reported in several publications. For example, studies in the Amazon region of Brazil found that more than 50% of cases with severe bothrops envenoming received underdosed treatment. In countries where antivenom is paid by patients out of their pockets, the situation can be even worse. In northern Cameroon in the late 1990s, 1 vial of antivenom represented the equivalent of 4 months of food of a typical farmer's family. As a result, underdosing became the norm, since farmers could not afford more than 1 vial, and in many cases as well, half a vial, as it was reported. Other possible factors for underdosing and underuse are that healthcare workers may feel that they are fully trained to manage correctly cases of snakebite envenomings. In addition, loss of confidence in antivenom therapy among healthcare workers has been reported in countries where ineffective antivenoms have been in the markets for decades, and this loss of confidence may also explain why antivenom is often underused. So what needs to happen? Our group of experts wanted to issue concrete recommendations. I won't read them all. You can't even read them anyway. So it would be too long, but I will just tell you that they fall into 5 categories. Number 1, there is a need to build global and national capacities to better regulate antivenom markets. And the WHO has a pivotal role to play to assist endemic countries in that sense. Number 2, procurement of geographically appropriate and effective antivenom needs to be improved. Pooled procurement between groups of countries in a given subregion might be a good option to obtain better prices. And we support the establishment of a proper multi-country stockpile of quality antivenoms in sub-Saharan Africa, as was described by Raphael for the first phase. Number 3, the antivenom supplier base needs to be strengthened And collaborations between producers within regional networks are recommended to facilitate the sharing of reference venoms, for example, to mutualize some other costs, and also to develop new antivenoms for species that are not well covered by existing antivenoms. Number 4, it is important to boost the demand for antivenom at community level. Education of communities, traditional healers, and frontline healthcare workers is crucial to increase demand for antivenom. People also need to know where antivenom is available. In many cases, there is this information is lacking. And since cost is a problem, out-of-pocket payments should be suppressed to access antivenom. Number 5, antivenom distribution at country level can be improved. GIS mapping, geographical mapping systems can optimize the geographical distribution of antivenoms. In addition, with proper training, it may be possible to decentralize administration of antivenom in small dispensaries and other primary healthcare facilities. So there's still a lot of work to do, and much of the recommendations that are in my speech actually are included, are supposed to be covered by the global strategy by the WHO. But if there's an advocacy claim to be done here, is the fact that this strategy still lacks funding, in spite of the support by the Wellcome Trust. There are not many donors supporting it at the moment, so that's something that we need to collectively do, is to advocate for that strategy to be implemented. I thank you for your attention, and I'd like to also thank all the co-authors of this publication who are appearing on this slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Julien. Question in the room on this? Or online, if you have a question online, please unmute.
May I ask a question?
Go ahead, please.
I'm Dr. Aniruddha Ghosh from Bangladesh. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, then do you find the fear of anaphylactic reaction or adverse reaction as something that is preventing the use of antivenom by the healthcare workers?
Yes, and our group had a discussion about that, that question was addressed by my colleague from WHO, and the basic requirements in a healthcare facility for administration of antivenom. Yes, of course, I believe, and there are some reports of that the fear of severe side effects and the lack of the perception that the healthcare workers may not be able to tackle that and to address it may be a reason why some facilities do not want to administer antivenoms. So that's why it's so important to list what requirements are necessary for good introduction of antivenoms, so that countries can plan themselves where antivenom should be stored. But yes, I think that this fear is real, is actual. I've seen it myself in several countries, and it may explain why some facilities do not want to offer antivenom treatment.
Because I'm asking, when we are thinking about administering antivenom at the below hospital level, like the rural hospital or the dispensaries where there is no physician, then this question should be addressed more rigorously. The chance of the anaphylaxis. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there another question online? Okay, so thank you again, Julien. And please, can we also thank all the speakers from this session?